The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet city streets, a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the old oaks that lined the sidewalks. Harold Jenkins, a 70-year-old man with silver hair and a life's worth of wisdom etched into his wrinkled face, made his way down the familiar path toward the pharmacy. His steps were slow but steady, his cane tapping gently on the concrete. He held a small plastic prescription bag in one hand, the paper rustling slightly with each step. Harold enjoyed these walks, even if his knees didn't always agree. It was a rare moment of peace and independence, something he cherished in his twilight years. His mind wandered to his son, Marcus Jenkins, a man who carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. Marcus was the president of the country, a role that Harold was both proud of and worried about. The world had changed so much since Harold's younger days, but one thing remained constant: injustice, lurking like a shadow, ready to strike when least expected. The pharmacy was only a few blocks away, but Harold liked to take his time. He enjoyed watching the neighborhood go about its business. The kids playing tag on the sidewalk, the shop owners sweeping their storefronts, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery on the corner. Today, he decided to take the longer route that passed by Jefferson's Armory, a local gun shop he rarely paid attention to. As he approached the armory, the door swung open abruptly. Out stepped Officer Greg Matthews, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. In his right hand, he held a set of newly purchased steel knuckles, the polished metal gleaming ominously in the afternoon sun. Greg's eyes were cold, reflecting a kind of authority that bred fear rather than trust. Harold barely noticed the officer as he moved to pass by, his focus on his destination. But the sidewalk was narrow, and Harold's shoulder lightly brushed against Greg's arm. It was a harmless, accidental bump, something that should have been met with a polite apology or simple indifference. Instead, Greg's eyes flared with irritation. In that split second, his mind twisted the harmless gesture into an act of disrespect. "Watch where you're going, old man," Greg muttered, his voice low and menacing. Harold, caught off guard, paused and turned to the officer. "I'm sorry, son. Didn't mean any harm," he said softly, his voice gentle and sincere. But Greg's anger was already boiling over. He saw weakness, vulnerability, and in his mind, an opportunity to assert his power. Without warning, he swung his fist, the steel knuckles glinting just before they connected with Harold's cheek. The impact was brutal, the sound of metal meeting flesh echoing through the quiet street. Harold's body crumpled to the ground, his cane clattering away as he hit the pavement. Pain exploded through Harold's face, sharp and searing. His head struck the concrete, and his glasses flew off, skittering across the sidewalk. Blood began to trickle down his face from a deep gash near his eye, staining his shirt. His vision blurred, and a dizzying wave of confusion and fear engulfed him. Greg stood over Harold, breathing heavily. He didn't offer help or show concern. Instead, a smirk twisted his lips, and his eyes gleamed with disdain. He leaned down slightly, his voice dripping with contempt. "Stay out of my way next time, old fool." Straightening up, Greg adjusted his belt, chuckled darkly, and walked away without a second glance. His boots thudded against the pavement, each step a testament to his lack of remorse. A few passers-by had witnessed the attack. A young woman named Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she rushed over to Harold. Kneeling beside him, her eyes filled with tears as she took in his injuries. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. A middle-aged man, Thomas, crouched next to her, his face etched with disbelief and anger. "Who does that to an old man?" he muttered, his fists clenching. Emily's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed for an ambulance. "Please hurry," she told the dispatcher. "An elderly man has been attacked. He's hurt badly." Harold lay motionless, his breathing shallow. His face, swollen and bleeding, was nearly unrecognizable. As the minutes dragged on, a small crowd gathered, their murmurs of shock and outrage blending into the background noise. The distant sound of sirens grew louder until an ambulance arrived. Paramedics jumped out, swiftly assessing Harold's condition before carefully lifting him onto a stretcher. The crowd parted, watching with a mix of horror and pity as Harold was loaded into the ambulance. Inside, the paramedics worked quickly, stemming the bleeding and administering oxygen. The ride to the hospital felt endless, the pain in Harold's face a constant, fiery ache. When they arrived, doctors and nurses rushed him into the emergency room, their voices blending into a blur as they examined his injuries. Hours passed. Eventually, Harold's eyelids fluttered and he slowly regained consciousness. The sterile white of the hospital room came into focus, the beeping of medical monitors filling his ears. His head throbbed, and when he reached up to touch his face, he winced at the sharp sting. Memories of the attack came flooding back, and panic gripped his chest. "Call my son," Harold whispered hoarsely. "Please call my son." A nurse leaned over him, trying to calm him. "Sir, you need to rest," she said gently. "No," Harold insisted, his voice stronger now. "Call my son, Marcus Jenkins. He needs to know what happened." The nurse's eyes widened. "The president?" "Yes. Please hurry." Skeptical but concerned, the nurse handed Harold a phone. His hands shook as he dialed the number. After a few rings, Marcus's voice came through, strong and clear. "Dad? What's wrong?" Tears welled in Harold's eyes. "They attacked me, son. A police officer. He hit me. Please, come quickly." Marcus's tone shifted instantly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm on my way. Stay where you are." Within moments, preparations were underway. A motorcade sped through the city, sirens wailing, as Marcus raced to the hospital. When he arrived, his face was a storm of fury and concern. Security and hospital staff stepped aside as he strode down the corridor, his eyes blazing. He entered Harold's room and stopped, his breath catching at the sight of his father's bruised and battered face. He sat beside him, taking Harold's hand gently. "Tell me everything," Marcus said, his voice trembling with restrained rage. Harold recounted the attack, his voice wavering but clear. Marcus listened, his jaw tightening with every word. By the time Harold finished, Marcus's fury was palpable. He stood, pulled out his phone, and called the chief of police. "Find the officer who did this. Now!" he commanded. The search was swift. Witnesses and CCTV footage identified Greg Matthews. He was arrested, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his actions. In the end, justice prevailed, not just for Harold, but for a system that Marcus vowed to change. As father and son left the hospital, they knew the fight wasn't over, but they faced it together, strengthened by courage, love, and the unwavering pursuit of justice.